Good morning and welcome to the State of the Nation breakfast. Getting you out here so nice and early, seeing people in person, it's very nice. I mean, it's great sitting in the studio, but it's even better having people in front of you. I'm sure, as most of you know, my name is Mike Sham. I have become the host of the State of the Nation. So I'm going to start off by giving you a bit of a history lesson as to how the State of the Nation came about. And we actually have two things to thank for the State of the Nation. The first one was Jacob Zuma. And the reason that Jacob Zuma is responsible for the State of the Nation was that we were just doing live events trying to get business people to put some money into our bank account when South Africa had its collective moment of madness. We got tired of growing at 5% and running a modern country, and the ANC saw fit to elect Jacob Zuma as the next president, which immediately sent corporate South Africa, quite correctly as it turned out, into a complete tailspin. And I realized that that created a business opportunity, and the business opportunity was to put people in a room and get analysts to explain to them what this madness meant. And we went around the country with people like Clem Sunter, Justice Malala, doing State of the Nation breakfasts. And these things became increasingly popular, and we would talk to thousands of people in Sandton Convention Centre, Cape Town, etc., and we would discuss this. And soon I realized that it needed a name and came up with the name of State of the Nation. So State of the Nation, in actual fact, has been around since 2009, ever since the reign of Jacob Zuma. The next part of our development happened as a result of COVID, which immediately put a stop to live events, which meant that we couldn't do our breakfasts. So in a moment of sheer desperation, and thanks largely to nepotism, i.e. my son, we started to fiddle around with streaming of events, and State of the Nation as I suppose the roots of what we see today were started in the middle of COVID. And it's now grown to a proper platform, primarily with these long interviews that I presume many people here sit through on YouTube. And a year ago, what is fascinating is exactly 1 year ago today, we started our YouTube channel with not one subscriber. We now have close on 16,000 subscribers on YouTube and over 80,000 across our social media platforms. So we are very, very excited about that. So thank you all for your support. We hope that it is adding value. We do have some big plans going ahead, going forward, especially with an election looming. That's a little bit like our World Cup. So, it's really great to see everybody here, and wonderful confirmation. We'll keep on doing our best to holding people to account. We're getting closer to getting people from the other side to speak to us. Just yesterday I finally got the number for Fikile Mbalula. I believe that he can't resist a camera. So I'm going to offer him a couple of cameras in the hope that he comes, and you'll know that that we would have reached a milestone when we finally get the EFF to come and speak there, explain their policies to us on the State of the Nation. I can promise you that we will not give anybody a free ride, regardless of the party. I recently did an interview with Solium Samanga from the Democratic Alliance. It got quite heated. I think that what they've done in the city of Johannesburg has been terrible, in that they had the opportunity to wrest control and chose not to do it in a moment of pettiness. So, whichever is the party, we will hold them to account. And hopefully, I think by doing that, I think we're serving the best interests of South Africa. Let's talk about South Africa for a second. Well, let's first talk about how today is going to play out this morning. What we're going to do is we've got a few changes to our lineup. Wayne Sussman, who was going to be here and talk about some election numbers, is in Cape Town, and Azar Jameen has had to go to a conference, but we've got a very capable replacement in Chris Hutting. So Chris, you're doing double work, but you don't even know that yet. And yeah, so we've got Sandile Swana, Chris Hutting, and Prince Mashele that are going to come and follow me up here and give their views for about 15 minutes each. We're then going to have a hot breakfast, and thereafter we're going to open the panel. Largely, I'm not scared of the odd microphone, so I'll ask a lot of the questions, but I also encourage people out there to ask questions as well. So it will be quite good fun, and we'll do that after we have breakfast, and that'll be around about just after 8 o'clock. But you know, in trying to prepare an opening for today, I actually started to speak to my good friend Mr. Mashele over there, and then I thought, right, I'm going to blow my speech. Let's stop this conversation, because I was starting to let out all the punchlines. But I want you to consider this. On the 9th of December, which is what, in just over a week's time, 9 years ago, Jacob Zuma fired Nhlanhla Nene. It was a Thursday night. It was a move that was designed in Saxonwold by the Guptas to replace a competent finance minister with an incompetent finance minister of their choosing by the name of Des van Rooyen. There was absolute outrage, absolute outrage. The country went wild. I don't know if you recall. It feels like it was 1,000 years ago, but it was 9 years ago. Quite a long time, but not so long that we should forget that the country really couldn't understand what was going on, and it seemed like just one step too far. We knew that we had an incompetent president, and we knew that we had corrupt ministers. We knew we had incompetent ministers, but now this was an assault on South Africa. And South Africans across the board erupted, right, in outrage. Have you considered that that move, which ultimately led to a reversal of that decision, and by the Sunday, Des van Rooyen had been released from that position, Minister of Finance, and Prince, I was about to say somebody competent, and then I realized I was going to say Pravin Gordhan and competent in the same sentence. A new finance minister was installed, right? But it was because of the outrage of the South African public. And I'm thinking to myself, where is the outrage in South Africa now? Right? We've got a president who does far worse things. And he has literally pummeled us into submission. We are very quick to say that Cyril Ramaphosa is a failure, he's a ditherer, he's a man low energy, incapable of performing any action. I'm starting to think that we've got it all wrong, Prince. Here's a guy doing exactly what he wants to do. He has got us to walk at his speed. He has managed to take the country and kill all the energy in the country. You know, South Africa used to have something like 70 protests a day. Right? These were people complaining they didn't have water, or didn't have this, or didn't have that services. They'd burned down a building, which obviously was quite useful. But that was part of South Africa. We now no longer even have that. Why? Because we are all walking at Cyril Ramaphosa's speed. Nobody is outraged. Right? Our children quietly immigrate. Children of all color quietly immigrate. We lose our professionals. We don't really care. We allow the government to move from, we even call it load shedding. We move from stage 2 to stage 4. We allow Eskom and ministries to lie to us over the weekend, say it's stage 6 when it's stage 8, right, of load shedding. Now, please understand that by any estimation, and I've got some energy experts over there, right, We've got about 4,000 megawatts of solar installed in this country, which is another 4 stages of load shedding. So when you have a weekend like we had, which is stage 8, but they call it stage 6, it's actually stage 12. But we say nothing. We all just have a failure to be outraged anymore. Right? And this is playing into the hands of Cyril Ramaphosa. It's not by accident, it's by design. I do not believe he's out of his depth. I believe he's achieving exactly what he wants to achieve. Right? Jacob Zuma wasn't good enough to get the country to accept his bad decisions. But Cyril Ramaphosa is. He's good enough to get us to accept his bad decisions. We just take what that man says, we shrug our shoulders, we say, look at him, he's a buffoon. He has, we've got a whole president getting a whole media to report on him, opening a tap. If you didn't see it, you would think it's satire. But you couldn't write that kind of nonsense, right? That a whole president of a country, supposed to be the most advanced country in Africa, is opening a tap. His spokesman posts a picture of a dam that was built in 1973 to say, no, that's what we were celebrating, the dam. The dam was built in 1973, more than 20 years before the new South Africa. But the president is opening a tap. And we are not even outraged. Yet 9 years ago, everybody was up in arms because we had Des van Rooyen as a finance minister. Just think of the people we have as ministers now. Just think of them. Do you know that our finance minister was kicked out of the Eastern Cape government because he's a thief? Because he's incompetent. He was kicked out. The ANC kicked out Godongwana from the Eastern Cape. But yet we were outraged about Des van Rooyen. The problem isn't Cyril Ramaphosa. The problem isn't the ANC. The problem is us. The problem is that people here with the most to lose are doing nothing. And it's time that we stop doing nothing. It's time that we get very vocal. It's time that we get outraged. It's time that we hold people to account. All of them. I had a very unfortunate discussion last week with, as I said, Solium Simanga. The Democratic Alliance had the opportunity, together with their so-called coalition partners, to retake Johannesburg. He says the reason that they couldn't do it, and this was interchangeable, was because they were going to pay 650,000 rand for this meeting and the snacks that you have to order. They must be very good snacks. And he didn't want to be part of that where they spend 650,000 rand. The money's spent anyway. He then says, I couldn't do anything because look at when they sent me the WhatsApp. It was 6 o'clock on a Sunday night. This is the sort of thing we should be outraged by across parties, but we are not. So I know that I'm preaching to the choir here because you made the effort to come and hear some analysts. But please understand that before we complain and before we give that title of, oh, well, Cyril, he's useless. He's not. He's extremely competent. He's doing exactly what he wants to do. He has got us walking at his speed. He has got us all on Valium. Right? The whole country is sitting there. Nobody's protesting. Nobody is questioning his cadre deployments. Nobody. And then what does happen is when you get into when you hear Parliament and you hear the DA complaining or the opposition party complaining, they sound shrill. They sound like Karens because we are just so used to accepting whatever's thrown at us. So certainly from my perspective on the state of the nation, I won't do that. I can promise you that. and I can promise to anybody who's going to be watching this broadcast, we are going to carry on raising the bar. We are not going to let people make bad excuses. And that's why you'll keep on watching the State of the Nation. So thank you for joining us. Join us, even a little, crusade starts somewhere. And I'm starting ours. Started ours already. You're in on the journey, right? I don't care where this leads, but I will not be one of those people that allows this to happen and said that I did nothing. So the least that we can do is understand that there's a very important election coming up. Our choices are poor, let's face it. I would love to say, we've got a wonderful coalition brewing. No, we've got a terrible coalition brewing, but they're better than these guys. Sometimes you've got to just hold your nose. But let's do something. Let's make a few changes, and let's be outraged. So, joining us, getting up on stage firstly, is a wonderful analyst, somebody that I was watching the beginning of the year. It feels like 1,000 years ago when I did do this. And this is the pain I go through so that you guys can enjoy the State of the Nation. I watched Cyril Ramaphosa drone on through a State of the Nation address. And I know that one of the other people who was watching that night, so there's at least two of us that managed to stay awake, was Sandile Swana. And I know because he was analyzing it on SABC, and I said to my poor long-suffering wife, this guy is really good. I must get hold of him, and I must get him on the State of the Nation. And he's been on a couple of times, and I think he's right up there with the best of the analysts. So he's the CEO of Africa Media Online, and he knows what he's talking about. So let's welcome to the stage Mr. Sandile Swana.
And thank you indeed, Mike. I think I'll probably spend the first 5 minutes of my talk making an informal presentation. I'll start the informal part of this presentation by explaining some of the things that could have contributed to me standing up here today. I was born in Soweto, Rockville, Soweto. And in 1976, I was a young schoolboy in White City, Chabavu, Soweto, at school. So when all hell broke loose, I was at school. I was one of those kids who were in the street in 1976. But I was not protesting against anything. I was running for safety with my younger brother. I did not understand politics very well at the time. But by 1979, it had become clear to me that I've got to be part of the process that overthrows the apartheid regime. And I committed myself to that. Now, some of the things that people ask me, I grew up in my school days as a science student. The first time I went to university, I went to study computers, software programming. But I was a political activist. So some people wondered, how did you end up being so involved with politics? And yet you are a nerd, computer nerd. But I believe that that period from 1976, where Black Consciousness, Steve Biko were the leaders at the time. So when we entered politics, we entered politics from the side of Black Consciousness and Pan-Africanism. The ANC became more and more popular after the launch of the UDF. And the final stages of my career in that line of work, if I may call it that, was within the ambit of the UDF and the mass democratic movement. In 1989, I was a delegate in the Conference for a Democratic Future. In the Conference for a Democratic Future, the purpose was to adopt what was called the Harare Declaration. The Harare Declaration was a declaration by the majority of the South Africans that indeed we are willing to enter into negotiations with the apartheid regime. I did not even believe that actually this whole thing of negotiation was going to happen. So in December 89, I attended that conference, left, I went to Swaziland. Whilst I was there, one morning I went into town in Manzini, and I saw posters of newspapers that Mandela was coming out of prison. Then I realized that these boys are serious. They want to talk. I came back to South Africa to celebrate that event. But the first point then that I want to make about this, which I think does need to be made, is that there was a lot of violence. More people died, in fact, between 1989 and 1994 than the whole struggle, that contestation. But even then, this is my first point I want to make. We went to the first elections in 1994. My second major, other than business information systems, was in economics. And I majored in development economics and African development economics. And I had observed the many disasters that had happened in Africa. And out of that, I had come to the position that actually we need some form of coalition government in South Africa, some form of government of national unity. For all practical purposes, I was on the side of the ANC. But I did not have the confidence that the ANC on its own was going to take South Africa to where it was going, to where it needed to go, sorry. As a result of that, and I can say this, in 1994, when I voted, in the national election, I voted for the ANC. In the provincial election, I voted for the DP in 1994. There's a very small party of chaps who would come with yellow shorts and liberals of some sort. Not because I thought the DP was cute. Democrats now call the DA, but I don't think the DP and the DA are necessarily the same thing. Because I felt that we need to move away from absolutism. We had lived under absolutism from 1948 to 1994, the absolutism of the Broederbond and the National Party. And in many ways, whatever level of success that we had achieved after 1994 under Thabo Mbeki especially, it was taking us into a new form of absolutism. When the ANC reached 69.69% in the national elections, that was a step towards absolutism. That was not progress, political progress, because the scope of thinking, the scope of different views, and independent thought was narrowing. Once one party gets, that's why somebody could stand up and said, we will govern until Jesus Christ comes back. And impunity was the order of the day, because we are going to, no matter what you do, all power is getting concentrated in us. And that is a mistake. And as I move on, I want to say also Mike Sham, if you are a student of history, social change takes long and it is very chaotic. Some of you, when you hear about people like Benjamin Franklin, some of the founding fathers of the United States of America, those guys risked their lives to start chaos in America, to overthrow the British out of there. So when you see something beautiful down the road, A lot of suffering and a lot of chaos has happened before. Now, this is the point in all of this. I don't subscribe to the idea that when we form a coalition or we form a nation or form a government, we must be like-minded. I have friends who are Catholics. I have friends who are Jews. I have friends who are communists. I have friends who are Zulus. I associate with all sorts of, and I don't want anybody to think like me. I think that is a mistake. This idea of like-mindedness, that we must be like-minded, is wrong. We cannot send people to university that they must be like-minded. We want independent thinking. And people must then look for the truth and find the truth and let the truth prevail. In other words, what they call evidence-based policy, evidence-based planning, and so on and so forth. Not a preconceived idea that you have, that it must prevail because you believe it, and you want to change our minds to believe that same thing. I can make a speech here today, this morning, and make a contradictory speech in the afternoon because I'm thinking throughout the day, and I'm trying to improve my thinking. So it's correct to keep on challenging your thinking. One of the men that I want to reference as I now want to talk about the current situation we're in and the one we're entering in 2024. There's a man, I think, who died too young. His name was Van Zyl Slabbert. He was an Afrikaner in South Africa. Some of you know him from the PFP, the Progressive Federal Party, and so on. But he was a very open-minded fellow. And his ideas are going to inform what I'm going to say about 2024. And I must confess that one year, when I was still a student, a debate was organized at Wits where I was a student. And it was supposed to be a debate between the ANC and the people inside the country. The people inside the country were represented by Zak de Beer. The ANC was in exile. And some clever guy decided that the ANC that is in exile will be represented by Van Zyl Slabbert. And some of us objected to this. But we could not object to this as an organization because the university policy at Wits at the time said we must allow all debate to happen. So you can't say you are objecting to this and take steps. So we debated what we are going to do about this until 3 a.m. or so in the morning. Then at the end of the meeting, we said everybody will be led by their own conscience as to what to do about this debate. It was going to be at the Great Hall at Wits. Nevertheless, lunchtime came, the debate was going to take place. For better or for worse, a number of us arrived at the Great Hall and we disrupted that meeting and it ended. We ended that meeting. And I was one of the people who pushed the security aside and stopped that meeting, saying that the ANC must represent itself in South Africa, not Van Zyl Slabbert. Not that I differed with Van Zyl Slabbert. Now, some of the ideas that Van Zyl Slabbert was trying to teach us later on as we progressed, which I think are relevant and we must try to embrace, is that this thing of proportional representation and even direct representation of constituencies and so on is pertinent because we must not want, like the Americans do, you are just going to have two political parties. How are we going to fit all of our ideas there? We must learn that we are all different and there must be proportional representation, and people on the day when they debate, the best argument must win the day. Right now, we're being railroaded by party bosses. The number of people who are voting has fallen below 50%. In other words, of the eligible voters, the ANC is in power today. In fact, everybody who's in power today, who's in office, was elected by less than 50%. The people who participated and voted were less than 50%. I'm talking even this last government election, when you total it up. So the legitimacy of this system, people are falling out, even when the ANC's numbers were going up to almost 70%, the number and the proportion of people voting was already declining in the country. So the legitimacy of the regime is not there. People don't feel that they are being represented. And also, I don't know who on earth is my MP, who represents me where I stay in Parliament. My ward councillor is a DA ward councillor, while at loggerheads have been removed from the WhatsApp group of the ward for whatever reason, and I complained that I'm oppressed, and then I was removed. I was asked to offer a public apology. I'm no longer a member. And there's all kinds of things like this. Now, what am I saying? When Mike Sham says he would like to see the EFF here, he is correct. You must see the EFF in a forum like this. You must see Freedom Front Plus here. You must see, no matter if you think the DA is very stupid, they must be here. No matter if you think the ANC, they are rogues, they are the South African Communist, all the crooks, the idiots, they must be here. Even in Parliament. Because we are going to destroy this country when we cancel people. You know this word that they say we cancel people, that so-and-so must not even be allowed to enter here. That was tried. The ANC and other parties were banned in 1960. What did that get us? We must not be afraid of the force of argument. The ANC and the DA, both of them, by the way, are declining in the polls. If you look at the actual IEC statistics, not the surveys that they do. So they've got all sorts of polls that they announce that they have now grown by 90% and what have you and what have you. There's nothing like that. I look at the IEC statistics. Those two biggest parties are declining. So you have a very high probability that some form of coalition is going to happen next year. The only word that I want to send to you is this. Let the voters of South Africa decide who gets how many votes and what coalition we're going to get. Politicians pretend that they have a way of dictating how many votes they are going to get and therefore where they will stand in the coalition. Just like the guy who said they will rule until Jesus comes back. I don't know if Jesus has already come back or what has happened, but they are getting out of power right now. They've lost power all over the country. They are losing power, those guys who said that. So next year we're going to get a coalition. The only requirement that I would say, let us not say Freedom Front Plus must be excluded. Let us not say EFF must be excluded. Everybody must come and give an account. Lastly, as I close, you and I am not a member of a political party. In 1990 actually, let me put it this way, when political parties were unbanned, I never took membership of the ANC. I never took membership of the ANC. When they fired Thabo Mbeki, I was already largely out of politics. And I decided to rejoin the ANC, maybe to help to put it back on track. And I discovered that ANC membership was no longer available to people like me. We're no longer needed till today. So I've never been a member of a political party since the unbanning of political parties in 1990. I am not a member now. And I'm sure many of you may not be members, you are just ordinary citizens. But we must not undermine our capacity and power to use the rights provided for us in law to change things in our wards, in our municipalities, in our province, and nationally. Even if you get excluded from the WhatsApp group of your ward, take a stand and continue to take a stand. Thank you.
Our next speaker has the distinction of being the very first person that was ever interviewed when we moved into our fancy new studio in Parkhurst. Chris, doesn't matter who comes afterwards, you will always be the first one. You are the Neil Armstrong of State of the Nation contributors. So for those of you that don't know, Chris Hutting is the Executive Director of the Center for Risk Analysis, and he writes some really great analysis. He's wonderful to follow on social media. His latest note is just brilliant, and I love the title, Perfecting the Own Goal, and it's about the debacle that is Transnet. But I'm not going to do his speech for him. Chris Hutting, please come on to the stage.
Good morning, everyone. Mike, thank you very much for the opportunity. To my fellow very learned panelists, and a great honor to be here with you this morning. Mike mentioned that I was the first guest at their new studio. You never forget your first time, so for good or for bad, I guess I have that honor. Mike has given me the brief to talk about South Africa's place in the world now at the end of 2023 into 2024. So if we think things are complicated here, how things are shaping up geopolitically could have even more serious repercussions for South Africa, given our current foreign policy choices, some of our moves around sending certain signals, as Mike mentioned, talking about perfecting the own goal. We rightly celebrate the Rugby World Cup victory. We don't talk about the cricket, but maybe our national sport should be really fixing and perfecting the own goal. We do that very, very well and make things all the more difficult for ourselves. So I'll just set the scene geopolitically and globally, and we can talk a little bit about the implications for South Africa. When it comes to elections, next year stands up as maybe one of the most significant for many, many years and decades. In 2024, of course, the big one in the US, Republicans and Democrats head to the polls. Many other Americans don't feel at home with those political parties, but they all head to the polls next year. There are also going to be elections in a number of other countries: Algeria, India, Mexico, Pakistan, Russia, Taiwan, probably Britain, given how they've done this year with their various prime ministers, and of course South Africa. All told, as many as 3 billion people head to the polls next year. That effectively means around a third of global GDP is up for grabs in the elections and in the polls next year. So in that global context of elections, of upending the status quo, possibly South Africa finds itself. It looks like for the time being, interest rates are going to remain elevated. Central banks are maintaining their line in that regard. Inflation hasn't dissipated as much as we had hoped. In that context, it is more difficult to attract investment and capital. And in that context, South Africa repeatedly sends signals that maybe capital isn't all that welcome here. Playing the non-aligned game on, for example, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but they're not practicing that non-alignment. Confusion around, is one going to close down the Israeli embassy or not? Fairly or unfairly, the current administration, it looks like things are confused. You're not sure who's in charge of what. Is it the president? Is it certain ministers? That in turn means for foreign investors from the West, but also from countries like India and China, they're not sure whether to punt on investing in South Africa. Do they invest that hard capital that we need? Our gross fixed capital formation hovers between 13 and 15% of GDP. The National Development Plan sets a target of 30%. We've never attained that target. And in that context, it's very difficult to unlock real investment and job creation. We've got our unemployment rate around 40% on the expanded definition. If you don't get capital into your country, you can have all the presidential summits and promises, but you're not going to have real, meaningful job creation. So in the context of trying to attract capital, we have our local elections next year. Of course, that means uncertainty and anxiety, I'm sure for all of you in the room, for many South Africans out there whose job prospects, economic prospects look very difficult. It adds to the sense of anxiety and uncertainty in the country. That creates the conditions for more revolutionary change, but in our own polling, we've seen across racial lines, across income lines, South Africans tend to be more middle of the road, more conservative, not wanting that sort of radical revolutionary change, but maybe wanting things to change more gradually. I don't know if that's scant consolation for how difficult things are, but perhaps we should expect things to change gradually over time and not all overnight. That is not to dismiss the idea of something like an Arab Spring taking place. We've got the conditions for radical change overnight, but we haven't seen that precedent in South Africa's history. So I don't think it's going to happen necessarily next year. In terms of our elections, we've seen the rise of the non-voter, South Africans choosing not to vote. Many analysts, many more middle class, upper class South Africans get frustrated with so-called ANC voters as though it is one bloc thinking with one mind, that they don't choose differently. Why do they not vote for other parties? They are choosing not to vote. They don't go and vote. That is them exercising a choice still. Other parties have not chosen to engage with them on their terms, maybe, haven't animated them enough to go to the polls. Could this perhaps change next year, to change that trend line of voter non-participation that has increased? As I mentioned earlier, in the global context of higher interest rates and less flows of capital and investment, South Africa continues to raise barriers to investment. Possibly tomorrow, the National Assembly will vote on the NHI bill. We heard yesterday that business lobby groups like BUSA, Business Leadership, they are sending urgent letters to the NCOP, the National Council of Provinces, the Deputy President Mashatile. It seems like maybe they think their processes of submission haven't really yielded the results that they thought and that we warned them would be the case. The Ramaphosa administration is an ideological continuation of the administrations that came before, even though the president presents it in a different light, the policy trajectory has been the same. We've got the NHI as a possibility. Expropriation without compensation remains strongly on the agenda. Whether one is for that kind of regime or not, again, it sends a signal of uncertainty around property rights, around land reform, all that kind of thing. Our logistics, of course, Transnet at the moment, the problems becoming quite exacerbated and highlighted. Over 70,000 containers stuck outside Durban Harbour, Cape Town Harbour, numerous problems, Richards Bay, banning the use of trucks for the time being because they just don't have the capacity for those trucks to come in. So we talk a big game around things like the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, around South Africa being the leader on the African continent, South Africa leading the African Union. But then we raise barriers to investment. We make it all the more difficult for goods to move, for businesses to operate. Electricity, we all know the details on that. So the challenges, as I mentioned globally, I think are going to become quite pronounced next year. You've got shifting poles of power, not necessarily a multipolar world, as we have been told, but maybe more bipolar between the US and China, vying for various interests and power bases. In that context, you have South Africa trying to be a leader in the BRICS association. You can make some pragmatic arguments in that regard for shifting a bit of control, but I don't think there's the cohesion in BRICS to make it really a sort of force like the G7 is. And of course, with the recent election of Javier Milei in Argentina, he has indicated in the past he would want to downgrade relations between Argentina and China and Brazil. Argentina recently admitted to the new expanded BRICS, so that's going to bring its own challenges to the whole BRICS constellation and for South Africa. Just in closing, then, in that global context of more uncertainty, shifting poles of power, investment, wanting still returns on investment, South Africa is unfortunately for now setting itself apart as not being that attractive to capital. This narrative could change after next year, but I don't think we should expect, even in your best case scenario, whatever that might be for a coalition government, that everything changes after 2024. For the short to medium term, our risk analysis of South Africa is still of a high risk environment. South Africa's risk premium is all the higher. That means investors demand more return for their investment with that higher risk premium. So for the short to medium term, things remaining quite difficult. Medium to long term, into 2029, we look at the potential for South Africa to then start turning on a positive trajectory. To reinforce what Mike said, to paraphrase maybe in my own words, if you look at how we often wait for change to come from national government or from provincial government, I think that could be shifting as we head in towards the elections next year, where the changes happen more locally and then move upwards instead of upwards and back down. That falls to us in the room. We don't expect any one of us to change it all on our own, but in different ways, in engaging with the communities around us, in engaging with political parties, business societies, civil society as well, strengthening those institutions, non-profit bodies, Chapter 9 institutions, we could put South Africa in a better position heading into 2029. But it's up to us to, I think, use that opportunity, realize the risks, use the information at hand, and act accordingly. Thank you.
Our last panelist is the one and only Prince Mashele. Prince is, certainly one of the most popular contributors whenever he comes onto the State of the Nation. And I personally love reading the comments when Prince is on the show, the comments on YouTube. He drives a certain sector of our population completely wild. I've got the feeling that he must be the most unpopular person in the ANC and in any ANC supporters club. Right? I think the only ANC club you're ever going to walk into is going to be wielded by a mob. But Prince Mashele has a long history. He's a political scientist. He does not hold these punches. And he has got a lot of fame and infamy, and everybody has waited for any moment to attack Prince Mashele, but we love him. Prince, please come on the stage, share your wisdom with us. You always have a home on the State of the Nation. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning, I'm greeting. It's not fake, it's real. Good morning. Are you well? I've been in trouble, Mike, for not making important disclosures in the past. So let me start by disclosing that you referred to 2009 and Zuma firing and Nhlanhla. I was in the National Planning Committee that planned all the protests that we were seeing, sitting the whole night, planning all the protests. So I've been active, Mike, and I think that got me into trouble. But anyway, you asked me to talk about the future. Let me start by stating my main thesis. And this main thesis will weave the past and the future together in order for us to make sense of where we are today in South Africa and where we are going. That's how I assist myself to understand what is going on. I think that South Africa is going through what political scientists call realignment, a moment of realignment. I think that's what we are going through. A moment of realignment in politics in the main expresses itself this way. You have a dominant force that had been holding society together coming to an end. So it's dying, that dominant force. And when that dominant force dies, everyone in that society can feel that this dominant force is dying. And when that dominant force dies, there are a few things. One, society feels anxious. So the whole of society feels anxious. Two, society feels uncertain about the future. So the future looks very uncertain when that dominant force dies. Three, there are opportunists who prepare to take over the dominance into the future. So that's what happens when you go through a moment of realignment. Let me be practical about it. We went through it in 1994. When the National Party was dying, we all felt and knew that this thing is coming to an end. A lot of us, whether you supported the ANC or you supported the National Party, we were anxious. We were not sure of the future. And there are opportunities that prepared to take over the future. That is exactly where South Africa is today. The dominant force, that is the ANC, it's dying. A colleague of mine and I wrote a book in 2014, The Fall of the ANC, What Next? People thought we had smoked marijuana. And at the time it was not legal and we didn't smoke it.
we could see the signs that this thing is dying. And when a party dies, it doesn't die in 1 year. It takes a period for it finally to be buried. So the ANC, let me repeat this. The ANC, whether you like it or you loved it, you hated it, it is dying. It's a dying party. That is why, because it is this force that had been holding society together since 1994, that's been at the center of our national life, we all now feel anxious. We are not certain about the future. But let me tell you what happened when the National Party died and which opportunistic forces prepared themselves to take over the future. And this, we may have missed it completely. When the National Party was dying, there are two political parties that prepared themselves and say, we want to liquidate this National Party. We want to absorb whatever little assets it has into us. Those two political parties were the ANC. Remember, officially the National Party actually dissolved into the ANC. Does anyone remember that? It was negotiated by Terrell Court. The ANC was excited. Let's liquidate this thing. Let's absorb it into us. The second party that prepared, an opportunistic party that prepared itself, was the DP. Sandil. Prepared itself. It was a small little thing. Let us liquidate this thing. Let us absorb it into us. So there were these two parties that prepared to absorb the dying National Party and absorb it into themselves. That is exactly where we are today in South Africa. There are two parties that are busy preparing to absorb the ANC as we speak. People don't see this and they don't think of it that way. And I'll tell you the two political parties. And these two political parties are contending for our future. They want to be the dominant forces into the future. The first party is the DA. This will surprise you. You've heard recently noises about a possible coalition between the ANC and the DA. Even the ANC have been talking about it. The DA cannot wait to liquidate and absorb the ANC into itself. And you will see where this is going when I talk about scenarios. That's the first part. They are preparing. They want this thing to die. They know it's dying. They say, whatever little assets, we want to absorb them into us. And we take over the dominance in South Africa. That's the first part. The second part that is preparing is the EFF. They are preparing day and night to liquidate the ANC, absorb whatever assets it has, and take over the future of South Africa. These are the two parties that are preparing to take over. Now, this brings us to scenarios next year. A lot has been said, but let me nail my colors. Call me after next year's elections. I don't use the language of however it would appear as though and that kind of stuff. After the elections next year in South Africa, there shall be a coalition government. Underline this. There shall be a coalition government. The day of one party governing South Africa, those days are over. And let me tell you, most of us will actually die under a coalition government in South Africa. We have entered that phase, and that phase is going to be very long. And sounds, in South Africa, when you say that, sounds, in Europe, there are countries that live under this thing. They are used to coalition governments. No, very few parties in Europe get an absolute majority, whether Italy, whether Germany, whether Spain. You are lucky to get 30% of the vote in Europe. You can be a leader of a coalition government with 20% in Europe. That's how it happens. So there shall be a coalition government next year after the elections. The latest numbers that I've seen purporting to be coming from Ipsos suggests something like this. ANC, 36%. And people's ANC 36%, DA 19%, EFF 18%, and the rest. Right? And, this might sound like, no, these numbers. Believe it or not, I believe these numbers. In the first place, I've followed elections from 1994. Ipsos is one of the most trusted polling companies in South Africa. And generally, they get very close. You can't get exact, but they get fairly close to the mark. And I've used their numbers to nail my colors. Even with the 2016 elections, people thought I was mad. I called what happened in the metros, and it happened. I was one of the few analysts who said there shall be coalition Johannesburg, Tswane, and people thought I was mad, but it happened. So, Sarah, why 36%? Some analysts say just under 50%. But here is my logic. In my traveling in South Africa, and I travel a lot, in my engagements with different South Africans in the rural areas and anywhere else, I have never detected the level of anger on the part of South Africans, elite and ordinary. Our level of anger as a society, I would argue, is at the highest. Whether my mother, who is 83 years old, she's voted for the ANC for all her life, and I don't talk politics with her. She just, out of the blue, tells me that I'm done with these thieves. And I'm thinking, what happened to this old lady? And these are discussions, when I listen to the discussions she has with her neighbors who are not educated, that's their thinking, that they are done with the thieves. We don't have electricity, we don't have water, because that is what they are battling with on the ground. So the level of, it's very difficult. Just listen to the radio stations, read newspapers, social media. It's very difficult these days to find proud defenders of the African National Congress. Even the leaders of the ANC themselves are ashamed to defend their own party. So load shedding is going to injure the ANC very badly. And of course, its consequences, job losses and all of that, and the pressures that we are all feeling economically. So my prediction is that the ANC will get under 40% next year. Two, what explains the reason why the ANC declined for the first time post-1994 below 50% in an election, and here I'm referring to the recent local government elections, is that the ANC lost big time in KwaZulu-Natal, from 54% to 41% in the previous local government elections. KwaZulu-Natal. It also lost big time in Gauteng. If you look at what had happened in 2016, it has declined to the mid-30s in Gauteng, local government elections. Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal contain almost half of our population. Most people don't know that, by the way. Gauteng, almost 16 million. You saw the latest statistics, right? KwaZulu-Natal, almost 13 million. Do the numbers. That's huge in terms of votes. The angriest South Africans are found in Gauteng. Listen to the radio station. If there's a pit latrine problem in Limpopo, it is the people of Gauteng who protest Section 27. It's not some people in Limpopo. No. In the Eastern Cape, problem is the people of Gauteng. And you can see the trends, by the way. The ANC started very high in 1994 here in Gauteng, almost in the lower 60s. In the previous provincial government elections in Gauteng, the ANC barely touched 51%. David Makura got just 50%, and they nearly never made it in 2019 here in Gauteng. I can tell you, Panyaza knows he's not coming back into office as premier of this province. This province will be governed by a different premier from a different party. The ANC, if it touches 30% in Gauteng, it will be very lucky. If you hit the ANC in Gauteng, you hit it in KwaZulu-Natal, and in KwaZulu-Natal, the ANC is going to lose. The Jacob Zuma factor in KZN, it's big. You hit the ANC in these two provinces, and you take 2%, 2%, 2% from Limpopo, from the Eastern Cape, and you will take 2% across. The Western Cape is gone until Jesus Christ comes back. The ANC will never touch 50% next year. So, the scenarios. Scenario number one, it's the ANC and the DA. And let me finish in 3 minutes. Scenario number one is the ANC and the DA. If you think of it, you may think, the DA has always been opposing the ANC. It won't get into a coalition government with the ANC. No. Their calculation is, let's grab this thing as it dies. And we will take over the future of the country. And their horse, it's Cyril Ramaphosa. They will say, Cyril, be president. John Steinhuisen, deputy president. The negotiations are going to be tough. All of this sounds unimaginable, but that's real in a negotiation. Yeah. John Steinhuisen, deputy president. And Cyril might agree he doesn't like Paul Mashatile, he's deputy. Yeah. And from what I know and what I hear, that's not far-fetched. Then even the noises we hear in public from the ANC, by the way, they are beginning to talk about who our possible partners are. The DA, they mention it. So that's the first scenario. Watch that scenario. I think it's the most likely. The second scenario is the EFF and the ANC. And the horse there is Paul Mashatile. Discussions had been going on between the EFF and Paul. And the whole plan was that they were going to kick out Cyril before the elections, and Paul, being deputy, was going to take over the ANC, and then the deal would be Paul, after the elections, would be president, and Julius becomes deputy president. There were even public meetings, by the way. This involved KZN. I mean, the provincial leadership of the ANC in KZN. You saw it on TV if you followed news. The only provincial leadership of the ANC that went into a meeting with the national leadership of the EFF in their offices in Braamfontein was KZN. It was public. They even took pictures. That was part of the deal. It also involved Gauteng, because these two provinces know that they will not come back. So the deal was, we would have this coalition thing with the EFF. We will give you KZN. We will also give you Gauteng. And then we give you the presidency, and Julius becomes deputy president. So that's a scenario that it should be factored into our calculations. I think it's least likely. The third and the final scenario. The third and final scenario is the moonshot pact. It's not going to happen. I know some people prefer that, led by the DA, Action SA, IFP, and the rest of it. Those people are egotistic. There are too many to negotiate anything. They backbite each other. Some of them want it, others don't want it, even though they get into meetings. I doubt it will happen. But it's a third scenario. Who knows? Anything is possible in politics. As I close, whatever coalition government we get as a country, we must expect South Africa to be chaotic for at least 10 years. I'm going to be honest with you. For at least 10 years, South Africa is going to be chaotic. So you need to fasten your seatbelts. If one party can fix our electricity problems. The same comrades who come from the same party, sit in the same boardroom, can fix our electricity problems. What makes you think comrades and ladies and gentlemen from different parties sitting in one boardroom can fix our problems? It's not going to be easy. It's going to be difficult. So we will go through this period of instability politically until we get one dominant party that is going to get 51% down the road. This, in my estimation, you're talking 15 years from now. Before then, we must get used to this instability. The shock absorber would have to be business. Business, if you're coming from business, you must think of yourselves as the shock absorber of South Africa going forward. But you must plan differently. The idea that you are going to speak to one minister who comes from the ANC and this guy is going to get whatever position into the National Executive Committee of one party and things are going to move in this direction, those days are over. You may need to talk to this fellow, talk to the other from the same other party and this and the other. And to get policy coherence, it's going to be extremely difficult. Maybe I should stop there. And yeah, thank you.